welcome back to Skeptics and Seekers. I'm Dale, representing the Christian or Seeker side.
And I'm David, the Skeptic.
All right, and today we're back to a regular show. It's between me and David discussing a topic, and this week it's my turn to choose a topic for you guys. And I wanted to start off a 3, possibly 4-part series on the Christian doctrines of the Trinity and the Incarnation, and try and check out the coherence of this. How do these concepts make sense? Does the Bible support these teachings, or is it contradictory with these teachings? These Christian doctrines, which are essential doctrines, right? You have to believe in Jesus' deity, at the very least Jesus' deity, to be saved. And that he came and died for our sins as an incarnate human. So yeah, I think this definitely fits in with David's theme of real Christianity for this season. So this week I am actually going to be making a claim, and we're going to be starting with the Old Testament. I want to claim that the Old Testament, the Protestant Hebrew Bible, is consistent or non-contradictory with the Christian notion of God being a quote-unquote complex unity, and that God became incarnate in human form. So this is a vague claim. I'm not defining that a complex unity has to be a trinity. That's just one means of being a complex unity, but I'm keeping my claim vague because the Old Testament doesn't get as specific as the New or as our models of the Trinity and that sort of thing. So yeah, this is what I claim to prove, that the Old Testament teaches God is a complex unity and could become incarnate in human form, at very least temporarily or permanently. So let's get into my case. So the first, where is it? Okay, so the first thing that we need to keep in mind here, when we say Trinity, I'll give David, for David's benefit, a working thing. So the Trinity is, God is 3 persons in one being or one substance. And I think it's summarized by the gospel, the opening thing in the Gospel of John, where in the beginning was the Word, that's referring to Jesus, and the Word was with God, so he's distinct from God the Father, and the Word was God, meaning that he's one in substance. So this is what we're aiming for with the Trinity. And when we come to the Old Testament, modern-day Jews will be vehemently against this. They'll point to verses like Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, and this is known as the Shema. This is fundamental to all modern Judaism. And it says, look, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Not a complex unity, but not some multiplicity of gods or tritheism or something like this. He's one. Furthermore, in terms of the incarnation, Numbers chapter 23 verse 19 says, look, God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should change his mind. So verses like these are really the proof texts that Jews will use to say Christian notions of the Trinity or deity of Jesus and the incarnation are totally against the Bible. It's some pagan religion or something like that. So in the first place, how do we respond to these? So my first factor is, are there any verses in the Old Testament that actively contradict the Trinity or the incarnation? And the answer is no. So in the place of the Shema, in all cases, whenever the word God is one, the Hebrew word for one there is echad, or I call it ishad. It's the wrong way to pronounce it. It's not yachid. Now, yachid and echad both mean one in English. Echad is like the English word one. It can have different meanings. There's one pencil on my desk. Or there's one team, the Toronto Maple Leafs. But obviously it carries with it different meanings. It can refer to complex unities. And in the Bible, it always refers to a complex unity. Like there's one vine with a bunch of grapes, right? The word yechid is never used, and that means only one, or an absolute oneness, in sort of a Unitarian concept of God. And this word is never used to describe God. It's always the word echad, which entails that there's a complex unity. So the Hebrew Bible, for example, uses this in Genesis 2:24. The man and the woman become one flesh, echad, when they're married. So yeah, believe it or not, there is no verse in the Bible that says God is one, in the sense that it's contradictory with a Trinitarian understanding, or another understanding of God as a complex unity. Now, in terms of the verses, God is not a man that he should lie. The Bible, it's not saying necessarily that God can't become incarnate or take on the form of a man or anything like that. It's talking about it in regards to his moral properties, right? God is not a man that he should lie or that he should act sinfully and that sort of thing. So that's what these verses, when you really read them in context, are actually saying. I quote Dr. Moshe Weinfeld, who's a Hebrew scholar, Jewish, non-Christian, and he mentions, look, with the meaning of echad, whenever it's used in the Hebrew Bible, it has nothing to do with the internal nature of God. So when we're talking about the Old Testament, when it's describing God's nature, or Yahweh's nature, it's not asking this question in a philosophical sense, like what is God? It's always asking who is God? And that's the way the Bible, the biblical writers, understanding addressing God's nature. And this sort of leads into Dr. Richard Bauckham's research on this and his notion of the divine identity, which I find to be a very helpful category. So look, there are two fundamental ways that ancient Jews in the Old Testament period thought about God. And they, instead of describing what Yahweh was intrinsically, they looked at his relations extrinsically. So his relations in terms of the covenant relationship with Israel. You know, what he did. He brought them out of slavery, out of Egypt, and his role throughout salvation history, or the history of the nation of Israel, and that sort of thing. And then the second was God's extrinsic relationship with all of reality or nature. So God had unique extrinsic relations to the Hebrew mind. He was the creator and sustainer of all of creation. He was the sole sovereign ruler over all creation. Pagan deities just didn't compare. I'll wait for David to bring that up. There's also a third sense, and there's I think it's Dr. John Sawyer in his article. He mentions that there's the cultic monotheism, there's the creational monotheism, but there's also the eschatological monotheism, where God is going to, again, assert his sovereignty over all of creation in the end times and do a bunch of good stuff at the end of the world. So this is really what the Bible focuses on. It's a question of who is God, or Yahweh, not what is Yahweh, which is what the Christians really in the second, third, and fourth centuries and beyond were really tackling. So yeah, with that, are there any positive indications then that God could be a complex unity, consistent with a Trinitarian understanding and that sort of thing? So the first thing is the issue of the divine word of God. So remember, I quoted the Gospel of John, and it calls Jesus the Logos, which is Greek for word. And basically, the Hebrew Bible actually reinforces this view. So, first of all, Jews at the times had this notion of the visible and invisible gods, plural. There's two gods, at least, excluding the Holy Spirit. So there's the visible God and there is the invisible God, and we'll get to that in a minute. But people like Philo of Alexandria had their notions. So this is for you, Arthur. I mentioned him. Philo of Alexandria had the divine logos, which was seen as a second God. In the Old Testament, there's this mention of divine wisdom, as though it is a second God, right? And logos refers to, in Greek thought, as a rational principle, or wisdom that comes about. So there's this notion of a mediator. Even in the Aramaic Targum, so these are the Aramaic translations of the Old Testament that were read in the synagogues during the time of Jesus and immediately before and after and that sort of thing. And they seem to not like the directness of God. So when we see in the Old Testament God is walking in the garden, that can't be God the Father. That's the memra. In Aramaic, memra means the word of Lord. And they do this constantly in the story of Noah, in the story of Abraham, where he meets the three people. It isn't God, it's the memra of God that they're meeting. Now, of course, these are just later Jewish traditions. They're not divinely inspired, but I think that it's indicative. It helps put in mind that ancient Jews recognize this interesting characteristic of the Old Testament, that there is this dynamic. It's not a strict, straightforward, monotheistic type notion, right? It's always the extrinsic, God alone is your God, and that sort of thing. But okay, there's also the notion that this infinite God dwells in our midst, right? He comes and dwells in the tabernacle. His Shekinah in 2 Chronicles chapter 6 it's saying that in the tabernacle God is said to dwell. His divine presence, or Shekinah, actually dwells in a tent. The Hebrew literally says, the Hebrew word for dwell is literally he pitches his tent. And then later when King Solomon dedicates the temple, he's also pitching his tent in a physical building. And Solomon himself is saying, this is so incredible that the high heavens cannot contain your infiniteness and your glory. But yet here you are dwelling in this earthly building made of stones in a localized place. So there's this tension there in the text. And on it, I would say that's possibly consistent with a Trinitarian understanding. Maybe God the Father is still sitting enthroned on heaven, but Jesus is in the place, or the Holy Spirit could be localized in the temple, or that sort of thing, right? That we get this whenever God is. So that's the third major argument here, is that I call it playing peekaboo with God, and I've hinted at this. So God is. The book of Exodus 33 tells us that God cannot be seen. His holiness is so infinite that just the sight of him as sinful creatures will kill us. This is unambiguous. You can't see God face to face and live. But unfortunately for Jews, the Old Testament is filled with personal encounters of God, seeing him face to face. Even in Exodus, the writer of Exodus himself says Moses and the whole assembly of Israel, the elders, saw God face to face. This is in Exodus 24. They didn't die, they lived. I mean, the verse telling us that no one can see God and live came after this. Another interesting case is Jacob. Jacob actually wrestles with God, Yahweh. Obviously, he sees him face to face. He touches him and wrestles with him, and is winning against God until he touches his knee or something like that. And Jacob is so amazed at this, he calls the name of the place Peniel. So in Hebrew, Peniel literally means I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. So that's in Genesis 32. And then finally, another interesting case. There are other cases as well, but these are the main ones that I wanted to focus on. Abraham, he has lunch with two angels and God himself, Yahweh. It's Jews will say, oh, that was three angels, but the Hebrew text is clear. It actually says that was God himself. So yeah, these are incredible. This is an incredible tension that I would say is at the very least consistent, perhaps in this case even demonstrative, that God is in fact a complex unity. So who are they seeing face to face? God the Son. And I didn't include this in my blog, but there is this notion of the angel of the Lord. Angel means messenger and that sort of thing. So in the burning bush incident, he sees the angel of the Lord, and he has to take off his sandals. The ground is holy because God is present with this angel. God's whole Shekinah is present with this angel. Now, Jews will try to explain, I'll help David out because this isn't in my blog, but Jews will say, well, this is literally an angel that has the name Yahweh. They call him Metatron. That's their explanation of this. But I'm sorry, in the ancient Hebrew mindset, names are sacred. That the name Yahweh, I am, belongs only to God. And a created being cannot have that name, because in the ancient Near East, names were powerful indicators. That's why it was so important when God gave his name to Moses. It was like a very revolutionary thing. So I would say in this case, the better interpretation is that's Jesus in the bush. Jesus is an angel. Angel is an ontological category. It's a functional category, right? You're a messenger of God. So God the Son is being a messenger for God the Father in this case. So yeah, that's an interesting thing. There are also indications that the nature of the Messiah would be divine. In Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, he would have the name Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and that sort of thing. And Daniel chapter 7 is another indication with the Son of Man concept, riding in the clouds of heaven. Now, riding in the clouds of heaven, that's a sign of divinity. The pagan god, the Canaanite pagan god, Baal, he rode on the clouds. We have texts describing him. The clouds are his chariots. This is a specific or explicit divine reference. And these concepts are taken by the Israelites and applied to God, to Yahweh. But yet the Son of Man is also now coming in the clouds. And this is why we get this, the better reading of this is that this isn't just some human, it's a divine, or some Jews of Jesus' day thought it was at the very least, a semi-divine being that's being portrayed to here. Well, there's another explanation, the Christian one. It's a fully divine being. It's Jesus, God the Son. And then my final case for thing in terms of the Holy Spirit. So I would say that the Old Testament treats the Holy Spirit as a person. It's not just an impersonal force. So here the link to God is obvious. That's not controversial. I can't see, like, obviously it's God's Holy Spirit. But is it actually a distinct person than God the Father? And I think that we have various things. So he performs certain actions or experiences certain emotions that are inherent to personhood, right? He instructs people, he teaches people, he speaks through the prophets. He can be grieved, he can be angered, and that sort of thing when he's rebelled against. So I think these are indicative of personhood. Now, one thing that I'll say here that'll help David, because I want to be honest with the audience, is during my research, there are some verses that in the Old Testament do describe the Holy Spirit as an it. And this is problematic for my understanding. It's going to, when I get into part 3 and start describing my model of the Trinity, but even right here, just that calling the Holy Spirit an it is problematic for saying that the Holy Spirit is a person. And I don't really have a total answer for those verses. There are verses that clearly call him a he and that sort of thing. But there are also some verses that call him an it, and I can't totally swear that. That is a problem where I'd probably just have to say that's an error on the part of the Bible authors or something. But yeah, if there are Christians listening, Arthur or something like that, Yeah, if you want to explain those verses, what you think, if there's an explanation for that. But yeah, that's my case for the Trinity. So, and in terms of the incarnation, that goes right. God's appearing in human form to Abraham. Clearly, there are countless examples in the Hebrew Bible where God takes on human form temporarily, but still he's taking on human form and he's pitching his tent. He's dwelling in that form in a localized location on earth. So that's consistent. In the time of Jesus, he just did that on a permanent basis. He did the exact same thing, but on a permanent basis. So yeah, I think that's my positive case, and yeah, I think I've really established it here that the Hebrew Bible does have this concept that Yahweh is a complex entity. He's not a Yahid or an absolute unity, an only one Unitarian concept, and the incarnation is perfectly plausible with the Old Testament scriptures. So yeah, I'll turn it over to David for his counter.
Well, I mean, Dale said it. He made his case. He knocked it out of the park. We just as well pack up and go home. Except, maybe not quite so fast. First of all, I want to go back to the very beginning, and just to say up front, rehash some of the discussion that Dale and I had off mic. I'm not entirely sure what his case is. So I know, and since I have had the experience of being a Christian, a Trinitarian Christian, I think I know what his case is. But I think some clarification is in order. So he's not, first of all, he's not saying that he's made the case that God is a quote-unquote Trinity. Just that God is a, scare quotes, complex being. Okay, so we're going to need to flesh out exactly what is meant by complex being. That's going to be a little bit of a challenge, and so I've got a few questions before attacking some of the points. Attacking may be the wrong word, but I mean I can't really rebut until I've got a pretty good idea of what we're talking about here. So, Dale, if you don't mind me just asking some clarifying questions, what do you mean by complex being, as opposed to, say, a simple being?
Okay, so I tried to deliberately keep that vague because, as you know, I'm leading towards providing a philosophical model where I spell out what I think the best model of making sense of this concept based on the scriptural data. Okay. However, I think even with the Old Testament, it's coming into place that a complex unity is not Yahid. It's not a Unitarian
try to do this without using Hebrew words, if you don't mind, because my Hebrew is a little rusty.
Well, okay, so Yahid means, sure, and just for the audience, just so you know what that means. So remember, I said there's Ichad, which means one, and there's Yahid, which means one. The Yahid, though, the literal translation is only one. So that's sort of like a strict Unitarian Muslim or modern Jew concept. This is the word that Moses Maimonides, who's the biggest figure. If you want to know what modern Judaism is, it started with him in the 12th century. So he uses that word to describe it. So it means an only one, in the sense of a Unitarian.
Right. But I would actually, let me just see if I can agree with at least the one thing that I thought I understood that you said that I think I can agree with, is when they talked about the oneness of God, they were never talking about God's ontology.
Correct. Yes.
No one was talking about the nature of his being as much as there's only one God to worship. whatever God is. They weren't defining God by saying God is one. So I would agree with that. But that said, I think that you put too much weight on these particular Hebrew words because, as we say, they weren't really talking about that. I don't think that was in view. So, we could punt to, they just assumed, that he was a simple unity. They didn't even have a concept of a complex unity, but whether they did or not, in the use of these words, that's not what they were talking about. So you can't really make a case either way just looking at the Hebrew words.
Right. So yeah, in the first place, that section is a defensive section. So it's responding to modern day Jews that will say, well, these verses prove that the Trinitarian thing couldn't be what the Bible had in mind here. So, in terms of supporting my point, I'm just bringing it back to the fact that it's consistent. But secondly, on a positive side, remember, I would also add that the Old Testament provides us with a positive understanding of the complex unity in that there are distinct. I was told by Tony Costa, make sure you say distinct, not separate. So I'm doing that to keep it clear. But
we're about to get there, I think.
Yeah, but there are distinct persons, right? And ancient Hebrews did have this understanding, the concept of the visible and invisible gods. This angel of the Lord, not being able to see God, but yet you see him face to face and you live. So I think that, and with the Holy Spirit having personal attributes, I think that we can say, whatever this complex unity is, it involves distinct persons, that it's not all God the Father. And we have to be careful when we read the Old Testament. This was a revelation for me when I studied it. The word Yahweh, is that always referring to God the Father in the Old Testament? No, not necessarily. That's a reference to the Trinity in a lot of cases. Now, it's not. Sometimes it does mean God the Father only, and you have to be careful in how you read it. But remember, Jesus himself said, I am Yahweh.
Well, you're right, but Yahweh is the only word used for God. There's also El, or Elohim.
But that's not his personal name. So that's more general, like the Baal, the gods are El, right? It just means lords. But you're right, yeah, Elohim, it's a, yeah, granted, I grant that.
So there's, I'm warning Melissa against making too much of a case of specific words that aren't talking about this. And so I will grant your defensive case. I don't think those arguments are very good. I think the better argument on the other side is just intuitively, this is how people thought. This is what they thought, and they were, we can't prove that they were talking about anything else. Now, as far as your other points, though, we'll get there. But I'm still trying to wrap my mind around the idea of a complex unity. So, or a complex being. So, you believe in substance dualism, as most Christians do. So one could say, from the Christian perspective, humans are also complex unities.
Sure.
So in what way are you suggesting God is a complex unity in a way that's different from humans are a complex unity?
Okay, so just based on the Old Testament text, I could say nothing. I could say, his Holy Spirit is like that. It's an element of him or something like that. But I think with the positive points that we'll get to, I think that does provide a little bit more. Whatever else his complex unity is, he has various. I think God is a complex unity in that he has various attributes. I'm not a medieval Aristotelian like Thomas Aquinas, where God is absolute being in itself and simplicity. Like Muslims and Christians tied themselves in knots as to God being a simple, divine simplicity, and that has to trump having other properties or attributes. No, God's a complex unity in that he has various attributes. Secondly, with the unique Judeo-Christian take that I think is coming from the Old Testament with my positive case is that God is also a complex unity in that there are distinct divine persons that share in the divine nature. That's really the wow thing that Christians go, there you go. That's what we're saying with the Trinity.
We're getting to this persons thing. I'm trying to
Flush out.
wrap my mind around how you are looking at complex being God versus complex being human, because one might say, well, we have an incarnate human, the body, and we have a spirit, maybe not a Holy Spirit, but a human spirit, and then we've got maybe a mind, which is, some people would separate the spirit and the mind, and then some people would go further and say, and then there's the soul, which may be, somehow slightly different. We have all these various components making up a complex being. And so are you saying that God is a complex being in that way, or is he different from that even?
So I know the answer, but I'm going to I know you hate this. I'm going to refrain answering that until part 3, because I don't think the Old Testament it doesn't describe that, right? Remember, it doesn't describe God's intrinsic nature or makeup. So
right. So you're saying it could be consistent with a human style complex being as well as some other style of complex being? Is that what you're wanting to leave the door open for?
Apart from the personal arguments, yeah, it could also be consistent with a united divine council, possibly.
So that this is kind of where I want to go to next, because once again, I'm trying to understand your argument before I just launch a straw man. Because if I launch an argument that is not your argument, then it's just a straw man. But it's an unintentional straw man because I really don't get what you're talking about. So I don't want to get accused of that, and I don't want to do a lot of unnecessary work, dispelling notions that you don't have. But I'm telling you as sincerely as I can, I don't understand the Trinity. I've never understood the Trinity, so even if we were talking about the Trinity proper, I wouldn't understand it. But even this kind of lesser version, just the complex being, it's still tough to wrap my mind around what's being discussed. So you mentioned multiple persons. Can we talk persons?
Sure. But okay. I was going to address the divine council idea, but you haven't brought it up yet.
Not yet. It's coming.
Okay.
I'm trying to take this a little bit at a time because I don't want to lose the audience.
Gotcha. So yeah, divine persons. Yeah.
Okay. So, would you say he's a complex being in that he is made up of multiple persons?
Yes, complex unit.
What is a person?
I will describe that in a later show. The Old Testament doesn't. Okay, so I see the problem, but we don't need to know for the purposes of our discussion here.
I need to know.
What I'm not going to tell you. The Old Testament doesn't tell us. So at this point, I have no idea.
Well, you used the term a minute ago, and you made a positive assertion that he was multiple divine persons. So, would you like to withdraw that for now?
No. He has personal attributes that the ancient Jews of the Old Testament period recognized to be unique to persons. And that sort of thing, right?
So you won't withdraw it, but you won't clarify it, and so I can't comment on
it. There's a broader sense, though, that we can recognize a person outside of a philosophical sense, right? You would recognize.
Then give me whatever definition of person that you expect me to work with here.
Sure. So he was a being that had certain features that were personal. He could relate to persons. He had emotions like a person. He had you know, he, yeah, like I don't know. I haven't researched what the ancient Jewish understanding of a person was, but they clearly could recognize it.
Okay, so you said that
Animals.
Tony warned you to use distinct as opposed to
Separate. Yeah.
separate. Okay, would you say that you and I are distinct persons?
Yes.
And would you say that you and I are separate persons?
Yes.
What's the difference?
Right. So this gets into the divine counsel, right? So it's not just he's complex; he's a complex unity. So in what sense would these divine persons be unified? Is what you're asking. Why couldn't I just say, well, there's a divine council of various gods? And
It sounds like you're saying that they're
that's
not separate persons, right? That God is not
correct.
right.
They're not separate.
If it was separate, it would be tritheism.
Oh well, they are separate persons, but the reason we don't, I'm gonna get in.
I'm not trying to get you in trouble. I am trying to.
No,
I'm
well,
trying to prepare to craft an argument that I just don't have enough information for.
Okay, all right. So I'll just reveal this much then. So okay, there's a heresy called partialism that we'll learn about in part 3. And this is the notion that God can be separated. You know, like you can yank Jesus out of the Trinity or something like that, and this is a heresy. No, God isn't composed of separable parts or that sort of thing. It's impossible for any member of the Trinity to be taken away from the other. So this is why Tony is telling me to use distinct rather than separate, because it might, even though there's nothing wrong with saying it's a separate person, he's anticipating that some people will think I'm arguing for this heresy of partialism, and I'm not. So that's all I'm trying to. But in terms of the Old Testament, what would unify it? Because that's other stuff that we're going to get to in future blogs. But in terms of the Old Testament, it's the divine name. These divine persons are called Yahweh. That cannot apply to a divine council of, like the Canaanite gods. They're sitting on a council, and there are lesser deities. It's more than just these beings have the divine nature, and they're totally separated from each other. They're independent beings. There is a unification. That divine person is Yahweh.
Okay, so how's that different from my non-divine person? I am David. Let's say my body is, body, and my spirit is spirit, but we're all David. We can't be separated. So you said that God would be different from that somehow, and I'm trying to figure out what you mean. You're saying they're different persons that are inseparable. I imagine you wouldn't say the different components of myself that I just named are not different persons.
Yeah, correct. Humans are Unitarian.
Oh, okay. So then, well, let's just go a little bit further. Let's just say I had a particular type of brain defect, or formation. I don't even know if it's right to call it a defect that allowed me multiple persons or personalities, which is a thing that happens with humans. Some humans are, in fact, complex persons. There is more than one of them in there, as far as distinct personalities. They're not separate, as you're talking about, but they are distinct. Would God be a person with split personality syndrome?
Yeah. So again, this is getting into part 3 territory where we make sense, where we provide a model.
Okay. I'm not trying to push where I can't go, but once again, I'm just trying to understand what the claim is.
So all I'll say is, as a teaser, is personalities are not the same as personhood. Within the confines of the Old Testament, that couldn't be the case because, look, God the Son, or Jesus, if we're saying that's what we think the visible God is, that portrays is in a localized area, all at the same time, simultaneously. God, the Father, is filling the heavens. So there are properties that are, I'm getting philosophical again, but there are contradictory properties that are obtaining for the distinct persons that would not be the same as just a schizophrenia, right? Like if I'm a schizophrenic, all my personalities are in that one place at the same time. So yeah, I would say even from the Old Testament, we can rule out God being a schizophrenic.
Okay. So I'm gonna just try to make my case that may or may not be attached to yours, but I did want to show the audience why I said what I said in my blog. Read the blogs, kids. I wasn't trying to be mean to Dale. I simply, there are limits on how much any of us can comment until we have more information of what Dale is talking about. So that said, let me.
Can I, just before you begin, like, since you brought that up, just to explain my reasoning approach, because I was contemplating, I was really thinking, would it be best to start with what is my model and then go and then do shows on the scriptural data? And I decided against that, because I think it's best to go by the actual process, right? First, you deal with what is the raw scriptural data? What does it say? You don't have your idea and then try to read that into the Bible. I wanted to show that the proper hermeneutical process is, let's start with the scriptural data. We don't have a model. We're just taking what the divine text gives us, and then afterwards, only then do we come up with various models to make sense of it. So that's why I'm.
But you are making a conclusion, though, that that the text is consistent with a particular conclusion that you have. So you're not. It's not completely separate from a conclusion. We're not just reading the text and contemplating it. You're reading the text and then connecting it to an idea that you have. And so, in order to do that, I need to see some of the connective tissue. So it's not pure hermeneutics as you're describing it here. But once again,
Sure.
I'm trying to play along as best I can.
Sure, and that's right. Like, obviously, I've already studied this, so I do have my end goal in mind, but I'm trying to illustrate as best we can what is the proper process. So that's all I'm trying to do.
Okay, so let me just take two of your points and see if I can, if not dismantle them, remantle them, put them in a slightly different light, because I think that you're looking at things as if to say, well, this is the only way it could be. And I don't think that is the case. So a couple of things. I don't think that you can say that the Jews were thinking about God in some kind of complex unity. I also don't think you can say that they were talking about God as a simple unity. I just don't think ontology was the question at all. So that said, the things that you point out that seem to be talking about a complex unity, I would bring up something I think you mentioned in your blog. You didn't in your recap, but the wisdom of God, for instance, just as an example. So the way these particular Jews at this particular time, and quite frankly surrounding nations, would have thought was, in terms of personifications of things, the personification of good, the personification of evil. These things must have some kind of something that personifies them. I think we would call that Platonic forms of things, ideas being expressed in perfect tangible ways throughout the universe. And so, even if you're talking about one God, you're talking about God's word, that could also be understood as them seeing a personification and speaking almost poetically about that, rather than tangibly. Now, they might also have been thinking about it tangibly too. God's word personifies itself as something different. But I don't see why we should look at that and think of that as anything particularly special, because one could argue they also did the same thing with God's wisdom. And yet I never hear Christians talking about God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and God the wisdom. And yet I think that case could be made if you look at how wisdom is sometimes the personification language of wisdom in the Bible. So the fact that Christians don't do that, and by the way, the fact that Jews don't do that, is indicative of what I think is an example that Dale and other Christians are starting with a conclusion that we've got these three members of the Godhead, and we're going to read that back into the text, and we're not going to read any other members of the Godhead into the text, which could easily be read there if you're reading the Bible consistently. So I think that it could be personification language of superstitious people, or it could just be poetic language. And I don't think that either one of those are ruled out. I don't think that we have enough yet, just looking at the text, to conclude they're talking about a strict ontology of God's complex nature. I don't think that we have enough for that. Now, as far as the second point, God seems to be incarnating all over the place. So surely this is an example of, multiple incarnation of God. No, I don't think so. Once again, I think this is consistent with how people of that time, and even later than that time, thought in terms of royalty, imperial kingliness, if you will. You don't even have to think in terms of a god for this. If a king sends a representative to a land with an order and a seal, that's the king. That representative is the king, and it's as simple as that. And so when God sends an angel, it is not, in fact, there might be some debate here, and we'd have to get into some scholarship that I'm not prepared to do right now, but I don't think that is inconsistent with the idea of saying God is here, that you spoke to God. If God sent a representative that came straight out of the presence of God, that's God. And so, sometimes, can I rule out the idea that God incarnated at times into these angel forms? No, I can't. But I also don't think that you can rule out that these angels would have been considered God just in the way that they considered a close representative of a royal being as being that being.
Okay. So in terms of wisdom, believe it or not, skeptical scholars would say it's the opposite, just as an FYI. So Dr. Nathan MacDonald, who's not a friend to my brand of Christianity at all, but he would say, look, originally, the ancient Jews did personify something like the wisdom goddess, a separate goddess, like me and you are separate. But then through the monotheizing trend, then they poeticized that and made it a property of God or something like that. In the book, where does it talk about the wisdom literature again? Is it Proverbs or Song of Solomon?
I didn't prep for it. Sorry.
Okay. So yeah, it's actually, the skeptics would be actually saying the opposite of what you're saying. But Christians do, right? They do take this wisdom and they say, well, that's the Logos, that's Jesus. But that's obviously reading in New Testament understanding. But it would be consistent with, this wisdom clearly is a divine attribute of God, and it's speaking of it in personal terms. It's debatable because it's in poetic form, so I don't think you could press it and say, well, that proves the Trinity or that sort of, or that God is a complex unity, in the same way I would take the other verses to do that. But certainly we that's consistent with a Christian understanding. Like you could read that verse to go, oh, that's divine wisdom. The divine wisdom is the Logos, the Word of God. The Word of God is Jesus.
Right, but the particular Christian
I don't
reading
see
would be
that.
to try to conflate wisdom with a recognized part of the Godhead. So they would say, well, that's just another word
Yeah.
for this other thing. And I would say
Yeah.
if they were being truly consistent, no, they would have a fourth member of the Godhead. And in fact, I think that there was a time when some people did. I think the reason wisdom got kicked out of the Godhead is because wisdom was feminine. So, again, not prepared to make that case today, but you have probably heard this before. So
Yeah,
it will not come as a
Jewish
shock.
mystics, the Holy Spirit is feminine too. Or the Shekinah is feminine. It's seen to be God's feminine aspect by mystics, even to this day, modern Jewish mystics. So yeah, there is some in terms of point. I actually do remember reading Dr. Shabbat 2:3. So you could say, well, isn't this a fourth person? Why does wisdom have to be consistent with the Trinity? And I guess strictly going by the Old Testament, I'm not sure I could rule that out, to be honest. I have New Testament reasons and Christian reasons for doing that, but that's something that I think I would need to think about. So that's a good point.
Sure, but all you would be
your
saying,
second point
if you
about the
made-
majestic.
just real quick, if you grant that point though, even a little bit, then what you're granting is, the Jews
think
could
it
be
needs to be-
wrong. They could be wrong about the nature of God. In which case, I don't know why we should care what they thought about the nature of God.
Jews could be wrong.
Yeah, they could be wrong about the nature of God.
What do you
In
mean?
fact, if they were suggesting that wisdom was a
I'm not sure I understood that.
so we were breaking up a little bit. I don't know if the people listening to this
Please.
will hear this or not, or if this is just Skype for us. But in case you guys are listening and you're wondering why we're talking strangely, there's some breakage here. But at any rate, what I'm saying is, if the Jews thought wisdom was a personification of God, and Christians say, no, Jews, you're wrong about that, then all you're saying is that the Jews are wrong about the nature of God. And so I don't know why we should care what they thought about, whether God was a complex being or not.
Well, Christians agree with the Jews in the first place, right? They do say that wisdom is Jesus. So they do believe
That
it.
wouldn't actually be an agreement, though. That would be a conflation. That wouldn't be an
But
agreement.
they do. But obviously, at some point, Jews disagree. The Jews today deny the Trinity. They deny that God is a complex unity. But so what? I don't care about the opinions of modern Jews. We know why they have those opinions.
Well,
so
no, I'm not talking
what
about
matters
that.
is the Old Testament.
That's a straw man. I'm talking about the
text,
Jews who wrote the Bible.
I think the ancient Jews who wrote the Old Testament did see. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm talking about the
Okay.
Jews that wrote the Bible.
What's the problem with the Jews? Right. So they wouldn't have known about Jesus. Okay. So they don't equate wisdom with Jesus. That's the main difference.
Well, I'm just saying that their Godhead has some different
I don't
persons
see that as
in
a
it.
problem or an issue.
Their Godhead has some different persons in it than the Christian Godhead. And what the Christians are doing is trying to harmonize those and make them out to be the same thing, and they're not.
I think that so ancient Jews did actually conflate. I'm not sure about the wisdom one, but they did actually conflate there's two gods that they saw. There's the invisible God, God the Father, and then there's this visible God. So they did do the same thing that Christians do. in terms of these incidents. They saw that there is this bifurcation of God. God the Father and God the Son, as we would say, as Christians would reinterpret that. So, yeah, I don't think that's an issue. I don't know if they saw wisdom as representing visible God. I don't think that's what the ancient Jews had in mind. So I would need to think about that in terms of how the ancient Jews would have saw it. But to me, it's just, yeah, they didn't think about, the Old Testament Jews weren't thinking about, okay, how many numbers, let's pin it down to, is there 3 or 5 or that sort of thing, right? They weren't asking the ontological questions.
Right. So from their perspective, there could have been 100. There could have been 100 distinct persons.
We're just saying, well, is it consistent? And a Christian, and that they're just not mentioned or something in the Bible? That's possible. One might try to argue that, well, we're only warned, if there were such persons, all such persons would have been mentioned in the Old Testament. Maybe one could argue that. So since there aren't 100 divine persons mentioned, therefore we can limit it to us. If there's 3, or if wisdom's a 4th person, then there's a quadrilogy. Okay, so I wanted to, before I forget, David, you also mentioned a point about the majestic plural. And this is usually a positive argument that Christians will say, well, see, that proves God's a complex unity, or the Trinity, or something like that. So what I'm talking about here is that in like the book of Genesis, the creation account, they'll say God, not a Unitarian concept of God. He's not an only one. And they'll present this as proof. People like Dr. Tony Costa, he still maintains this. And if you check out the sources, he goes into great detail as to why he thinks this is still a great argument. And I have to admit that in earnest, that this is an argument worthy of consideration, even though I purposely didn't use it. I'm iffy about it. So here's the reason we use this as a proof for a complex unity. In the first place, we have this is an ancient Near Eastern custom. It's sort of akin to the royal we. It's not necessarily speaking to the ontological nature, but it's magnifying God's greatness. And we have texts where other cultures do this for kings. They do it for other gods. It's the highness. And even in the Bible, there's always this consistent standard. So the Akkadians did it, the Sumerians did it. And look, it first refers to them in the plural, and then right afterwards, it goes back to talking about them in the singular. And the Bible does this in these verses, let us make God in our image, but then right after it goes back to referring to God in the singular. So I don't think we can press this. I'm iffy on it. It might be an indication, but I don't think we can press it as though it proves God is a complex unity because it refers to an us. It could just be this device known as the majestic plural. However, here's one thing.
We'll get to that more. I do have something to say about that.
Well, here's one point that I think is really important. So Dr. Michael Brown, for example, he also agreed. I'm on his side. He would agree with me that we can't really press this majestic plural as proof for a complex unity or a trinity or something like that. But there is an interesting question for you skeptics to ponder. What is the origin? Where did we get this concept that the use of a majestic plural signifies highness or up to the heights of heaven and greatness and that sort of thing? Young earth creationists might try to say, well, there's all these ideas about the flood because there actually was a flood and that spread. Well, maybe God is a complex unity, and through Adam and Eve, they referred to him. Highness came to represent the majestic plural because God was a complex unity, and human beings knew that at first, and then it became corrupted over time to where they would apply it to human beings. And that I can't prove that's the case. Like I said, I don't use this as a positive argument myself, but it's something to ponder.
I find that a trivial idea, but I can't.
Okay.
I don't want to lose time, even chasing it. Chase it in the comments, folks. I want to get back to the idea, though, that of the royal representative, more than the royal plural. God sends angels to earth, and they represent him, and to the people who see them, they are God. Not that they are Yahweh ontologically, but they are Yahweh representatively.
So that's a concept that's not in the Bible, at least not in the way that you've described it. So yeah, they are Elohim. It would describe king as Elohim, or these angels as a lord or something like that. But it's not. Okay, so put it this way. So in scholarship, it's called Yahweh exclusivism. So the ancient Hebrews saw Yahweh in a class all by himself. He alone is God in that class, and has the divine identity, as Richard Bauckham would put it. And remember, I outlined the two fundamental ways that they saw God, Yahweh, as being exclusively God. Sure, God has divine representatives. He has angels, or what you call the divine thing, the divine council, right? And there are certain texts. Now, with the exception of one or two,
I haven't gotten to the council yet. Just to be clear, I plan to get there too. I'm just talking about the representative of he sends a messenger to do a thing or say a thing to another human. To that other human, that messenger is God. Just as it would be with a king. The king sends his right-hand man to do a thing in another one of his lands. That is equivalent to the king visiting that land and making that order. If you attack that man or reject that man, you have caused a war because you have rejected the king. No one is making a distinction of, oh, well, that wasn't the king, that was just the king's man.
Right. So there are Jewish understandings. So like Moses is said, if you're standing or sitting on the right hand of God, this is almost, at least in the late Second Temple period, Bart Ehrman will argue this. Okay, well, that's a topic for New Testament things. But, right, so there are representatives that are seen as representing God and God's will. That's undeniable from an Old Testament perspective. But you go beyond. I'm sorry, it's just wrong. They don't see the representatives as God or Yahweh. No, none of these representatives take on God's unique name. And you need to understand how important a name. I assume you know how important a name was for the ancient Near Eastern mindset, right? Like it's not just
is very important to all superstitious
right.
Societies that we know of. I don't know of one where names weren't important. Knowing a person's name, you can capture their soul. All kinds of things associated with that. So yes, I understand that name was important here.
So my point is, none of these representatives get to be incorporated under the name Yahweh in the same way that the visible God does, or wisdom does, or the Holy Spirit can adopt the name Yahweh or something.
Right. What I would question, though, is that we can look at the instances of these names in the Bible. Like, for instance, one of the arguments, this is a translation kind of argument. Whenever you see the word Lord with a capital L, it means angel. But when you see Lord in all capitals, then it means Jesus. I think this is just giving too much credence to the idea that you have somehow, the exact words and tenses, passed down by God, or so, that somehow these various words used for the name of God weren't themselves matters of translation by someone who wrote them down. So I don't actually give much credence to the argument that, oh, but this one is Lord versus Lord.
Okay. So first of all, you should, but I don't think that the way whoever gave you that argument is just wrong about what the words mean. But okay, so Lord with a cap, Lord when it's translated Elohim from the word Elohim, that can refer to angels. It can refer to God. It can refer to earthly kings. It just means Lord. It's like when we say hello, my Lord, or something like that. So there's not, that only refers to angels. I don't know who told you that, but that's just mistaken and wrong.
Well, no.
Okay.
That's a misapprehension of what I was trying to say. I'm saying in the Bible, when you see Lord and it's referring to one of these messenger beings, if it's a lowercase l, it's just an angel. I mean, just a capital L, it's just an angel. Whereas if it's all caps, then that's a different Hebrew word, and it's referring to the person of God himself. It's trying to make that distinction. I'm not saying that Lord always means angel. I'm just saying whenever an angel is referred to as Lord in the Bible, that's the distinction being made. I don't believe that is. I don't believe that we can know that.
Okay, so we can. This is basic scholarship. Okay, well, yeah, well, just I guess the scholarship would say
indisputable.
It is like I don't even think skeptics deny this, because I know of none that would question what this distinction, right? So they are correct in doing the all capital Lord. That is Yahweh. That is being translated. That is God's divine identifiable name. So that does only reply to the Godhead, or sometimes God the Father, depending
on. But what I'm saying is, I don't think that we can, because we don't have original autographs of this stuff. And so when the person who wrote that down as the name of God, maybe that's what he thought how he thought it should be translated. But we don't. What I'm saying is, there's no way to know whether that is actually the word for Lord handed down by God. And you're making a case based on the precise words used in any given moment, and I just don't think that we can do that. I think that we can look at the literature of the Bible, though, and take what we know about the societies of the time, the literature of the time, and make at least the case that Lord can mean, or that a messenger of God could refer to God. I'm not ruling it out that it couldn't refer to the divine being, but I'm also saying that you can't rule it out, that it just means that this person recognizes that this is God. This representative of God should be listened to in the same way that you listen to God. I don't think that we can say more than that from those. So, when Jacob wrestled with an angel, I think it's absurd to say that, oh no, he wrestled with the actual God. God is an all-powerful being. He is an all-powerful being. Jacob can't wrestle with an all-powerful being. Are you kidding? That's an incoherent idea. It's just utterly incoherent. So, if you say
God has the power to fake it, right? He can wrestle. It's not saying he wrestled with all of his power to defeat Jacob and just couldn't. Jacob isn't an iron chariot. I mean, come on. So that was meant to be a joke.
Yeah, no, very funny. I think once again, you've got to understand the soft nature of my rebuttal, because I don't fully understand your case. I am saying that if you were suggesting that it could mean, this stronger thing, that there's, God is incarnating into other things, I'm just saying it could also mean that this is a representative of God that people recognize as the authority of or presence of God. The Ark of the Covenant wasn't God, but it was a representative of his authority. Nonetheless.
So here's why that's not So, setting aside the translation issue, which I didn't get to respond to, but look, that's not true, because Abraham, in his case, he didn't meet God, all three gods. He distinguished the two angels from Yahweh himself in the account where he had lunch with them. Then he sent the two angels to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Yahweh stayed behind and talked to him and left. So it's distinguishing Yahweh from lesser creatures or angels and that sort of thing. It's not the case that, oh, if you're a representative of Yahweh, you get to take on his name. Even modern Jews would, with all of their things, would strongly disagree with you today, and they would say, no way, that there's only one angel that's special. That's Metatron. Only he gets to adopt Yahweh's name, and that's explains the visible God or something like that.
Sorry, I'm there's only so far down the rabbit hole I can go here. I'm not debating fairies and Harry Potter and every bit of Jewish superstition. I'm sorry, I can't.
Okay, but the point stands in the Old Testament, they distinguish, right? If what you are saying is true, that you become a representative, therefore you get to be called God, then it would say all three of these people were Yahweh's or whatever.
Well, I don't think it's inconsistent to write that, but I think in that particular part of the story, there was a reason that the person wanted to distinguish between the angel and the God. So I mean, I'm not saying that your view can't be correct.
Okay.
I am simply saying that your view is not the only obvious view, and sometimes another view is correct, and we just have to get a little bit more specific and a little bit more definitional in order to do a better job of this thing. So yeah, sometimes when the representative of the king comes, it's the king, and sometimes the king himself wants to go talk to you. And it's proper to say in both times I spoke with the king. I saw that the king came to visit me. It's proper to say that whether the king came to visit you or the king sent his right-hand man to have you sign a document.
Okay, well, I would just say from an Old Testament perspective, that's not proper. That's not the way they did it. Maybe English people talk like that or something, but that's not the way the ancient Hebrews who wrote the Old Testament would have thought about it. Now, this is assuming your point. Yes, you're correct that I'm assuming the text has been preserved properly, right? Since the Dead Sea Scrolls or that sort of thing. We do know that there is the use of this name from archaeology, but obviously we just have bits and pieces. So you need the text to be able to create the distinction that I'm trying to, like, I couldn't argue against what you're saying just based off the archaeological evidence that mentions Yahweh or something like that. But yeah, I guess so, I just have to assume
this is a very technical argument. I get this, and I don't want people to get lost in this. Neither one of us are crazy here. I mean, this is not where I can use my signature batshit crazy line. I'm sorry, people.
Right.
Maybe we can get that in part 2.
Oh my goodness.
But
I'm in shock. So I'm at the table. I'm not ridiculous for once. Okay.
Well,
take that, Tara.
Right, but then again, your point hasn't been fleshed out enough. So once it's fleshed out, then we can put the tag on it. But
okay.
But right now, yeah, it's a little bit too loose to get any label. So you're talking
and I think that's a reflection of the Hebrew text. The Old Testament itself is a little bit loose. It doesn't spell things out about God's nature in the same way the New Testament does. Even the New Testament we'll find is a bit loose. It's not a philosophical argument.
Yeah, I don't think the New Testament actually helps. But but yeah, so let's circle back around to one other point before we move forward. The royal we. This will help us transition to another of my points.
And just before we go, just for the audience, so yeah, my case is contingent upon. Let's just assume that the Old Testament text that we have has been preserved properly from the originals. Maybe we can debate that for another show or something. But yeah, my argument is assuming that for the sake of argument.
Right. Dale's argument assumes the text is divine in some way, and I do not. I assume that the text is literature, and so I'm talking about the text strictly as a piece of literature. So that said, Royal We, this is problematic, I think, because it does speak to culture. I don't think it speaks to theology at all. So you kind of have to say, well, culturally, the people who wrote "Let Us Make Man," maybe sometime in 1000 or 1100 or whenever you want to date that. You would have to know something about the person who wrote it, and we don't, and the culture that wrote it, and we really don't. And so it's kind of hard to say what they would have meant by us. And so I would argue that the most straightforward reading of the royal we, in pretty much every time you see it in Scripture, is to take it literally. I think that we actually meant we, more than one of us. And the reason why I say that is because we have plenty of examples in the Bible where there's more than one. So God is not, in the Old Testament, depicted as being alone in heaven. He's not alone in heaven. He is depicted like a king, surrounded by a royal court. And I'm not saying that the other people around him are other gods. Maybe we might say demigods, but they're not other gods equal to him in his court. But he does have a court, and he has advisors and scouts and so forth. And so when he says, "Let us make man," he could be talking to the same people that we see later in Genesis, who are informing him about the what's going on with the Tower of Babel, or he could be talking about the same us that when they figured out what to do with old King Ahab or whoever it was. I mean, there are plenty of, or it could be the same us that we see in Job when Satan is standing around with the royal court. So everywhere we look closely in the Old Testament, we don't see a solitary figure sitting on a throne in an empty room. Heaven is occupied and the royal court is occupied, and I suspect that when God says us, he means us. It's the us that we think it means.
Okay, so this is interesting, because as a Christian, I could be tempted to take advantage of you and say, okay, if you're going to give me that as a good argument, then I'll take it, and that
take it
proves that. Well, no, because I got to be truthful, and I think that scholarship, we do know about the culture. We have other ancient Near Eastern cultures where the exact same form is used, right? And it always starts with the plural, then it goes into the singular. And the Bible's following this formula perfectly. There's an ancient Akkadian text where it's describing the king in this way, and there's a Sumerian text where it's describing things this way. I think there's a Ugarit text as well, but I need to look that one up. So scholars recognize the form, and they know from the context that it's not meant literally, at least on a balance of probabilities. Now, like I said, there are still Dr. Tony Costa. There are many Christian apologists that still use this, and I'll provide his source. He's familiar with the biblical scholarship. He agrees with me on this. He would agree with you that yes, this is the Trinity. But yeah,
no.
So
I didn't say it was the Trinity. I didn't even say it was a complex being. I just said
it's a multiplicity.
Yeah, there's more than one guy hanging around. But no, we're not talking about the nature. I'm just saying. Mm-hmm. Plural means plural. And the reason, once again, the reason I say that, I'm not pointing to Hebrew words or ancient scholarship. I'm pointing to the text itself and the weight of the text in the Bible itself. So that's all I got, people. I'm not a Hebrew scholar.
Right, but it's important to understand.
So when
Here are some
so when I'm pointing
oh,
to the
sorry.
when I'm pointing to the biblical text, it's don't just wave that off. That I'm pointing to. I think I mentioned three distinct places where God is actually, where you can actually see that there's a multiplicity of beings, and so us can mean us. And I think that to say that it means
Sure.
something else, you would actually have to make a better case that in this instance he only meant himself as a solitary being, as opposed to those other instances where there were other beings hanging around.
Right. So yes, in the first place, yeah, us can and does mean us in the Bible. It doesn't in this specific context, in this particular use. The scholars have good reason for this, right? And so in the first place, why does it follow this form? Why does it go to the singular? It should be still referring to it in the plural if plural people are doing this. In the second place, even in the case of the particular writer of Genesis, which teaches a doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, God alone is existing, and He creates light. There wasn't this heavenly host. God creates that. That's the Old Testament biblical perspective. So there couldn't be an us before, in your sense of the word, taking the text of Genesis specifically in context.
Well, I would just disagree with that.
So there are reasons.
I would say that neither you or I could prove our case beyond what we've said here, because now you're basing it on kind of the timing of when God created the heavenly host, and we don't know that. So my assumption, and I will go ahead and acknowledge this as an assumption going in, is by the time we see in the beginning God, the first words of the Bible, that the heavenly hosts and all of that other stuff was already there. And that the angels were already there, and that, in fact, we had already had the drama of Satan and the fall and so forth. And so the beginning there doesn't represent to any kind of beginning from God's perspective. It's just the beginning of this universe. But that there would have, in fact, already been the heavenly host. So it sounds like you're suggesting that, no, we don't have that yet. In which case I would ask, well, when do we get that? But I would just say you can't prove your case, and I can't prove you're wrong. But I think that more people would agree with me than you on that particular point. I got nothing beyond that.
Well, yeah, we'll deal with it when I get into the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, because I promise Arthur I will be doing that show after I'm done with the Trinity and that sort of thing. Okay, so.
All right, so I did have a
segment.
Okay.
Oh, I don't know. Have you? So you brought up this heavenly host, right? And
well, let me ask you to put that on hold for a moment, because the reason I brought up the royal we in the first place was to segue into another important part of the discussion. So let me put that out there, and you can decide which one you want to comment on. But I need to pay off the segue here. And so the reason why I invited you to go ahead and use my argument was because I don't think it helps you. Yes, I do believe that there was a host. And this gets into part of the nature of what you mean by a complex being. So there are plenty of places where you could read, I suppose you could read it your way and say God is a complex being, or you could read it in that God is a host of beings, a simple host, as opposed to a complex unity. But what we both agree on is that it wasn't just, one butt in a chair. And that's all that the universe contained outside of this earth.
Okay, so in terms of my point, I think I think I could concede everything you're saying about the us and what you're saying now, and it proves my point, because I'm just trying to prove that the Trinitarian doctrine, or this notion of God as a complex unity, as I've semi-defined it, right? He's distinct persons in unity of being, or something like that. You're saying that could be a valid reading, and that's all I require for my claim to work. So I could be happy with that. I guess what you're getting into, so we have to be honest about the Old Testament and the nature of the monotheism that was at play. So as I said, right, we all agreed that they weren't thinking philosophically in terms of the ontological nature of God. They weren't asking the question, what is God? They were asking, who is God? And there are texts. So there are three. So I'm taking this. This is from a scholar who's, again, not a friend of fundy Christians or anything like that, but John Sawyer wrote an article that I found helpful called "Biblical Alternatives to Monotheism," and he classifies in the Old Testament there are basically three types of texts, and he uses this to disprove the Enlightenment notion of strict monotheism or a Unitarian monotheism. And he says, look, there's a small group of texts in which monotheism is explicit. So these come usually in later texts, like the prophets. So in Isaiah.
I would agree with that mostly. By the way,
okay.
So I'm gonna grant some of that even before you finish. I think that they did get to monotheism eventually. They didn't start there.
Okay, and bear in mind though, so John Sawyer disagrees with that. He doesn't believe in he's trying to refute that there's an evolutionary development from polytheism to monotheism that developed. He thinks it was more of a mixture. And again, this isn't like a biased Christian. This is just a secular scholar. So his notion is that there was this mixture, and you can detect these trends throughout the Bible. And so, yeah, and he gives three different types of texts, and he says there's a second group of texts which, although not originally monotheistic, so this is sort of the wisdom thing that you were talking about, have under the influence of Deuteronomic texts been interpreted as such. And then there's the third category of texts, which is the most problematic or embarrassing for modern Christians and that sort of, and these seem to be blatant polytheistic texts that seem to endorse the existence of other pagan gods or that sort of thing, speak as though they're real.
Yeah.
But John, and those have to be admitted, there are these such texts, but John Sawyer says, look, there is this, throughout all of these texts, even in the blatant polytheistic ones, there is a monotheizing trend that's going. So scholars will call this Yahweh exclusivism. Yahweh is on a scale, he's beyond what these guys are not divine beings or gods. Later Jews would call them demonies, right? They're demonic entities and that sort of thing. But I don't think the early period during the monarchic period, pre-Babylonian exile, they were polytheists. The Bible itself claims they struggled with polytheism versus this monotheizing trend. It wasn't the whitewashed Sunday school version where, everyone knows God exists, and then, for a couple of years we dilly-dally or whatever. There was this mixture, a weird mixture in the monarchic period. And the Bible, the Old Testament literature, is reacting against this in different ways and trying to say, no, God alone. So sometimes it describes this in a way that seems to support polytheism, that says, look, these other gods are nothing compared to God, where there are other texts that are stronger in Isaiah that says these things are just stone. You can crash them on the ground. They're nothing. The nothingness is the technical term they use, the nothing texts. But throughout all of this, there's this unifying theme where they're monotheizing, and Yahweh is exclusive. He alone is God in the terms of the Godhead. His heavenly council, they are beneath him. They don't dictate terms. Apart from one or two texts, God is never taking advice from his council. He is telling them and enacting it. There are one or two occasions, right? There's Satan in Job, which again, Job, it's could be not literal.
Let's not slide
it's a poetic text, so you can't press.
Slide to that. though. I mean, we can say that about anything. That's at least one place where it looks like God is taking advice.
Right, but you would have to be aware that how do you interpret that text?
Okay,
and I don't.
But now you're just theologizing at that point. I'm just looking at the literature.
Since when am I not allowed to do that? And
well, not in. I mean, so you're just making the question. Then, I mean, if you're going to stop doing hermeneutics and just do theology, great. But hermeneutics is a literary art, and when you do theology, then you're just superseding the hermeneutic. You're superseding the literature, and you're just saying, okay, this presumptive thing is true, and you're kind of reading it back. I mean, right now we don't have any reason to say, at least from the literature, that this story of Satan and Job was not literal. And until we had that reason, then I'm not sure why you would bring that up, other than to say it's uncomfortable and it's a way for me to get rid of it.
No, but we do have reasons, right? Remember, Lydia provided them on the show. She provided certain reasons that we can identify the genre of Job as not being history in the same way Second Chronicles is, or it's not that genre.
So I don't recall that segment on the Lydia McGrew show. I didn't listen to that for this show. So I
no, neither did I. But by the way, I just remember it. But yeah. So okay, so we can agree that there are a couple texts that indicate God is interacting. Another one is the lying spirit thing. But the vast bulk of all the texts don't speak this. But
you only need one. I mean, we don't get every interaction in heaven. We don't get every interaction, with what goes on in the White House. Sometimes Trump might listen to his advisors, and he might start a sentence with "we're setting out this policy," and then switch to "I'm going to do this or that." I don't think you can make too much out of that, and I think you're making a meal out of a crumb.
Well, I'm just saying this is one of the indications that. So I can actually take these texts literally. I personally am not totally persuaded that Job is not meant historically. I think that I can actually take it historically, and it's still not an issue. God's sovereignty isn't impinged because he uses instrumental means such as a lying spirit or something like that. But I'm just saying in general, in terms of John Sawyer's point, this monotheizing trend, they're saying God is absolute. He doesn't take counsel from people. He is sovereign over everything, and he merely informs people. So this is the monotheizing trend that we're going to, apart from these, these couple texts.
Apart from these texts that show that he's not right. So yes,
but yeah, if you have like hundreds of texts and then just two that are out of sorts and two that can be interpreted in ways that do not impinge on that, then this is a point to consider. Like I said, and even if it's wrong, I don't care if John Sawyer's point is right or wrong here necessarily. My notion of God being sovereign can survive even if he takes advice from Satan. So okay,
let's stick with your notion of God being sovereign then, because maybe that's something I have a ghost of a chance of understanding. So sure,
yeah, but I'm happy to present Sawyer's thing for the audience to consider at least. But yeah, okay. So let's. The point is, my overall point is that there is this struggle that is evident in all parts of the scriptures, even the scriptures that are embarrassing.
That there is a struggle in the scripture over God's nature, and I believe that monotheism wins out in the end. But the difference between you and I here is you would say, oh, well, it's not a real struggle, it's an apparent struggle. And it becomes clarified over time, whereas I would say different people over centuries had different and or refined ideas of who and what God was. There were times in these centuries when people didn't know who Moses was. We lose sight of how long a period of time this was. I mean, we're in 2019, getting ready to flip the calendar another year. Go back to 1019. And look at all of the stuff that we have institutionally forgotten, and just misremember. This is and we're talking about more than 1,000 years, I think, in some of these cases. So the fact is, you know, I don't think you can make the kind of case that you're wanting to make with the crumbs that that survived.
Well, okay. So this is my claim. My original claim has been established regardless of this question about where the Jews, you know, like the Sunday school version of monotheists, or was it a mess, and that sort of thing, with many Jews being polytheists and henotheists and all, and you know, this the Old Testament reacting against this and trying to monotheize from within.
Hey, can we just take a moment and clarify some of these terms? I had a note here because I knew that these words would be tossed up. So monotheism is the belief in only one God and no other gods. Polytheism, and it's not only the belief, it's the belief and worship of the one and only true God. Polytheism is the belief and worship of multiple gods at the same time. Henotheism is a belief in multiple gods, but the worship of only one God, as one God is supreme. And then there's another level of it, catheism, cathenotheism, I want to say.
Okay. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, well, so...
Can you spell that?
Yeah, I probably can. But as soon as I pull it up on the computer here. Okay. Yeah, Katheno. So it's henotheism with a cat in front of it. Cathenotheism. Anyway, what that means is serial worship of multiple gods. So you believe there's multiple gods. You only worship one of those gods at a time. So you might worship one god as supreme today, and then someplace else worship another god, you know, in that place. And so I think that, in fact, if we're looking at the bulk of the Old Testament, they were cathenotheists more than anything else, because they actually did believe in multiple gods. How do we know they believed in multiple gods? Because they were always going off worshiping other gods. This is not in question. The reason I don't go off and worship other gods is because I don't believe in them. I don't believe they're there. The reason they went off and worshipped other gods is because they did believe in them. They only believed, though, that any given god was supreme at any given time in a given location. So the idea of God was very local, and so it was kind of serial worship. So what they were not, for the most part, were polytheists. There may have been some part of them that was polytheist, at some period of time, but I think that largely they were not polytheists, and that they worshiped lots of gods at the same time. Just as a contrast, the Egyptians were polytheists. And even then, it was based on pantheons, I would say. So, I mean, the Egyptians would worship their pantheon of gods, but not give your god any particular credit. So they would have been kind of polyhenotheist. The Jews were more cathohenotheist, because they would go off and they would worship Moloch, for a while, if they're in Babylon or whatever, and they'd go off and worship Baal in Assyria, or wherever these things were. It was always for them a matter of who's the strongest god here and now.
Okay. So yeah. First of all, this is great. I learned a new term that I never heard, so that's always awesome. So yeah, look that up for everyone. But okay, so yeah, I don't know. I don't think that the Jewish people were all single file. I don't know about the distinctions enough about cathenotheism versus versus polytheistic or well, I know henotheism and stuff, right? One's
just big cat in front of it, and so
yeah. Gotcha. Okay,
tongue twister, but we understand what we're talking about.
Okay, so let's be honest here. David's absolutely right. On the scale of time, there are and this isn't controversial even for you fundy evangelical Christians. I posted this in a response to Brian yesterday. There are multiple times that the Bible itself tells us the Hebrews were ignorant. They were ignorant. They totally forgot about the law. King Josiah was shocked. He's known as a great king. He stumbled across the Torah and went back to living according to, which implies he totally forgot about it. After the Babylonian exile, we're told the Hebrews totally forgot everything about the Old Testament. So this isn't a controversial claim. The Bible itself tells us this, and there are repeated instances in the Bible, especially during the monarchical period, pre-exilic period, where the people oscillate between polytheism or kenotheism. I don't really care about the difference and that sort of thing. And I think that they happened at the same time, right? There's different people. We know when certain monotheists, strong monotheists, were in power or going around, the people didn't always follow their leaders. We have archaeological evidence for Asherah poles. It's in the Bible.
I was going to bring up Asherah poles in maybe your next podcast,
okay.
saving a little something for the people, but yes.
Well, that wouldn't be relevant to the New Testament, right? That's relevant here in the Old Testament, right? So Asherah.
Because I don't know what your roadmap is, I wasn't sure where it's going to fit best.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, it fits here, so yeah, we can bring that out. Asherah was for the Canaanites and that sort of thing. She's Mrs. God. Yeah. For El, for the Canaanites.
She's God's wife. God's consort is not even strong enough. She's God's feminine other half.
Counterpart. Yeah. So Israelites were influenced by this, and they had worshipped Asherah poles. We have archaeological proof for this. We have biblical.
Yeah, right. I was just going to say you don't even need the archaeological proof for this conversation. It's all through the Old Testament.
It's in the Bible. Yeah. So it's a mess during the even up to the monarchical period. In terms of the culture and the Hebrew people, I don't know. I mean, we see these trends even in polytheistic things. It's not even fair to call them straightforward polytheists as opposed to kinetheists or henotheists, because in Egypt and in other cultures, they oscillated at times. So Egypt, the most famous example is Akhenaten, who became a quote-unquote monotheist, which I don't know if that's true. Maybe he was a henotheist or something, but he worshipped the sun god, the one god. He's the father of King Tut. And this destroyed the polytheism of the day, and the Egyptians overthrew them and that sort of thing, and got rid of that and went back to their traditional polytheistic notion. But John Sawyer brings up these pagan polytheistic examples where there's a monotheizing trend. He doesn't want to say the ancient Jews pre-exile supported monotheism. He's arguing against that. But he's saying that there was a monotheizing trend, which could be consistent with the kenotheism or henotheism, and even a mixture going on simultaneously, which I think is more accurate if you're looking at the people. So what matters for us making our decision is, what does the Bible, the Old Testament literature say, not doing a cultural survey, which the Bible tells itself was a mess at the time. The Israelites were not always faithful to God. They should have known better, but they didn't, and they went back and played the harlot with other pagan gods and stuff and goddesses. So Yeah, in terms of the Old Testament, that's what really matters for my claim. And we can see even in the blatantly polytheistic texts, we can blatantly see a monotheizing trend countering it, saying no, Yahweh exclusivism. God alone is the one true God. He is the God of all. He is the God of gods. He is the King of kings. He created all reality, including those fake pagan gods that you think are real. And this carried over into the Second Temple period by saying, there's this oscillation. You're just stone and statue. I can push you over. But there's also at the same time a recognition that there's demonic power, right? Demones, that stands behind the worship of these pagan gods. And that's how I would interpret these blatant polytheistic, or what John Sawyer calls the quote unquote embarrassingly polytheistic texts. I think there is a real ontologicalness behind the pagan gods. It's demonic. So it's correct to speak of them. Yeah, the idols themselves aren't true gods. They aren't divine in any way. They're just, these are just stone. You can throw them over. They're created, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But there is
these idols were representatives of gods. I think it's almost too simplistic to say, well, they worshipped idols and Jews worshipped a god. They were representatives of gods in the same way that, you might say Catholics worship idols. Well, they don't think their idols are actually God. You can, Aaron built an idol, if you will, representing Yahweh. That was just a hunk of gold. Didn't mean that there wasn't a God behind it. And so it feels almost strawmanish to say, oh, well, these other guys' gods are just chunks of wood.
So you made a point. I wanted to refute that. When it speaks of, there are two categories. I can't find the reference to the scholar that I was reading this, but there are two categories, right? So there's the divine council. These are the angels and that sort of thing in the heavenly host.
Right.
And
just
later
as
on,
you're saying that the divine council, the heavenly host, this is what I was talking about earlier with the we. I believe that would have been the case in the minds of the writers, and that does not, in fact, reflect any kind of complex being. So you can argue, well, it could be a complex being, but it also reads more straightforward as just a divine council of separate individuals.
Right. Okay. So in that case, I agree fully with you that the divine council, the question that we're debating now, which is I thought it was your claim, but you're just giving it as a statement of belief. It's totally separate from my claim in my blog, right? So my blog is interested in what is the nature of Yahweh. Forget about whether henotheism or kenotheism or whatever is true. I don't care. I'm just saying we've got Yahweh. He's an exclusive category of his own. What is his nature? Is he an absolute unity or a complex unity? What we're discussing here is a separate issue. What is God's relation to the heavenly host? And I totally agree with you. That's talking about the angels. Those are separate. They're not just distinct. They're not unities. These are creatures. And
the only reason we're talking about these separate hosts is because you won't give me a more full definition of this complex being. So I don't think we can talk about or extrapolate the nature of Yahweh. We can extrapolate the nature of other things and other gods and other parts of the council, but we don't have enough to extrapolate about Yahweh's ontology yet.
Well, but there are hints to it, and
all I'm saying is every hint that you're giving can be read a different way. I'm not even trying to say that your hints have to be wrong. I'm just saying that they don't have to be right, and they don't. It's not intuitive to read it your way. If you bring with it a Christian assumption about trinities, then you can read it that way and not be crazy. I don't think it's crazy. Okay. I think it's a nice try.
Well, that's all I'm arguing for, right? Like I tried to turn this into a prophecy, not a prophecy, but like a divine understanding argument, and yeah, I couldn't do it as a G-belief authenticating event, but anyways, for my point, great. My point has been established. Then, even if you want to say that different interpretations are equally possible, I can just say I don't care. I don't have to favor my interpretation over one. As long as it's equally possible, then they're consistent. They're not contradictory. But
okay. I don't know what that gains, because I think it's a fairly weak point. This would fall under. I don't think she would mind me calling her out. This would fall under Teddy's formulation of anything's possible. But you haven't proven that your case is particularly likely, or that it's more likely than just a simple committee.
So in the first place, I think I have, because I do provide positive reasons that rule out God just being a complex unity in just the sense of having a heavenly host. That's what I was trying to get to in my point, right?
I think you might get to that when we talk about persons and what a distinct versus separate person is. But because we couldn't get very deep in there, I don't think that you have touched on that yet. Now maybe you will in episode 3, but I don't think you've gotten there yet.
Right, because episode 3 goes beyond what the ancient Hebrews had a clear concept of people being they had a very primitive understanding of what a person is, and they, in the same sense that they view themselves as persons, not in a philosophical sense. This is why I'm hemming and hawing when I'm saying this, but they recognized that God, they were made in the image of God. God was like them. He wasn't like a dog.
Right. I think that they thought about persons in the same way I think about persons. So
great.
I'm as primitive as they are, maybe.
Cool. So that's all I need. That's all I'm not trying to go beyond that in this episode at all. And that's. But I wanted to respond.
But
you made a point that I felt.
Let me just cap that off, though. If they think about persons the way I think about persons, then you can't be right about them thinking about complex beings the way Christians think about it, because they're very different. So we really have to dig a little bit deeper into this idea of personhood to get to complexity. Because right now we're not talking about complex beings. We're just talking about something that's really confusing and it sounds oxymoronic.
Okay, so in terms of your point, though, so with henotheism and all of that there is a distinction that the ancient Jews understood. They recognized they didn't have terminology of a complex unity or something. They weren't piecing together the pieces of the puzzle, perhaps, but they understood the distinction, the one and onlyness of God aloneism, right? God, Yahweh. Let me finish. Yahweh alone. That distinguished him from the heavenly host. That distinguished him from the false gods. The gods were not in the heavenly host category. They were in the second category that Nathan MacDonald brings up. The false god, the demons, that sort of thing. They were not a part of God's heavenly host. But you are correct. Even with the heavenly host, we can see a monotheizing trend there and it's bad. Like the Hellenistic Jews increasingly we see them stop mentioning the heavenly host. There's a trend away from them because they thought it was too close to God, I guess, or something like that. So, but even in the earliest times when it wasn't an issue to talk about the heavenly host, the angels and that sort of thing, they clearly saw Yahweh is exclusively in a category by himself. And that's what the scholarship indicates, and that's what made Israel unique, because with the other cultures, when they went through kenotheism or henotheism, and they did do this, they would switch or oscillate between ascribing various attributes of different polytheistic gods, and they would occasionally give it to all one God supreme, or say that this one God supreme and shares the different attributes that previously were for different polytheists. So these trends happened, but it would oscillate to different gods. So one week it would be, this is an exaggeration, but like one decade it would be Ra, Amun-Ra, who had all these, and then the next it would be, I don't know, Isis or something like that. It would be fluid, whereas the Hebrews are unique in the ancient Near Eastern world for being consistent. Yahweh exclusivism, and that never changed. Yahweh was always seen in this category, even in texts where they're blatant polytheists that would be embarrassing for modern sensibilities or something. They had this Yahweh exclusivism. He is in a category of his own, whether you think there are these other gods or or a heavenly host or whatever. They recognize Yahweh exclusivism. So that's
I don't actually disagree with any of that, but I would say that these texts are large. A lot of these are written by the priestly class. All priests are exclusivists when it comes to their gods because that's their livelihood, it's their career. So unless they were a part of a limited pantheon like the Egyptians, those priests would be representative of a particular set of gods, but they wouldn't represent the enemy's gods. For instance. So I don't think it is surprising that the texts would lean toward exclusivism, since that's kind of how these people got paid. But that said, there's still an embarrassing amount of information in the text that suggests that even the writers themselves did not exclude the idea of other gods existing. They just thought that their God was the best one.
I don't know if it's even that simple, because remember, the state became polytheistic. There were so many bad kings who paid these priestly class, and even the official institutions were corrupted on multiple occasions, according to the Bible. Just reading the Bible, it's a fundy Christian or whatever, it tells us this. So I don't even need to rely on scholarship or archaeology. So it's not as simplistic as I think you want to make it. Like, the establishment was always strictly monotheistic, and they had the one.
I don't mean to make it any of this sound simple,
Okay.
because it is not simple. I think that a simpler reading of these texts, if you're trying to figure out God's nature, I think the more straightforward reading is the better reading. But once again, we will make more of that case as the weeks go by. The politics behind it, no, none of that was simple. This is what I mean. If God was, in fact, if understanding the ontological nature of God was important, and God was communicating directly with these people, we would expect them to have a very clear, solid understanding of who he is. I mean, for Pete's sake, he's talking to Adam and Eve directly in the Garden of Eden. We would expect people to have a very clear, unified idea of what kind of being God is from the beginning throughout. That would be a clear, consistent message in the Bible, and it simply is not.
Well, yeah, I don't think we would have an expectation for it to be clear as such. Like, I mean, yeah, God gives. Yeah, but people are stupid and they forget things, as you said, right? This is over a long, long period of time. So, like, and people are sinful. I mean, even the stories themselves, within the same people that saw the miracles of the mountain standing over them when they came into a covenant relationship with God, they still sinned and went after tried to build a golden calf and stuff like that. So it's
I think that's more to do with the nature of the fact that these are made up stories, more than the idea that people are sinful and stupid. I think that stories need plots and plot points to move them along. I think this is, I'd put this in the same category as, the story of Peter rejecting Jesus at the end, all the apostles rejecting Jesus, and then none of them hanging around to see if he would rise from the grave. Instead, they go fishing, and it's not actually human nature that we would forget something like that. That some of these very people were in the room when Jesus raised dead people. And so I don't buy the idea that they're real events, that, one day they're raising dead people with Jesus and literally the next day they're running from a few guys with swords. That doesn't read true to me.
It does, though, right? Because we even in the modern world, we have people. Whether you think they're right or wrong, we have people that do believe they've witnessed miracles. They think it's real, just like the Israelites supposedly witnessed God's miracles in front of them. And yet, the next day they go on sinning, or they go on making a false.
Their claims don't read true to me either. So I'm.
Oh, you think they're lying about the miracle itself?
Lying is a harsh word. I think that if they really believed the magic they claim to have seen, they would be different. I don't think that anyone who's seen real magic would view the world in the same way that I do. For instance, I'm a strict materialist, and especially if you've done the magic. If you have said hocus pocus and raised a dead person, tomorrow you're not running from a guy with a sword. Sorry, not happening. That is not. If you actually did it and you actually believed it, you don't stop believing it the next minute. It's a little bit like saying, well, this doctor, he did an amazing heart surgery, he did a heart transplant, and then another patient comes with a bad heart and he says, oh no, that's impossible. I don't know how we would ever replace a heart. No, that's not how we know that, no, this is a thing we can do. I've got some experience doing this, and you don't suddenly, unless you've got some kind of brain damage, turn around and forget, what the nature of your abilities are. And so, I think that these are story plots, and it reads to me as false when you're talking about the Jews going off worshiping other gods, God literally just did this thing, held the sun in place for, an extra hour or two or whatever. And then, then when they wake up the next morning, they build an idol. No, sorry, that reads false to me. That reads like a storyteller trying to tell a story. It doesn't read like human events.
Right, but that does happen in the Bible. So in terms of there are false elements for the sake of storytelling, right? There are literary devices that make us reading the modern text go, how can you be this stupid? But that's it's not reflecting entirely everything that happened, and once you know all the details, things make sense. So it's even like reading the tale about Acts of the Apostles. There are some things you might say, well, that how did this happen, right? Because he's conflating events, or he's writing about the events as a story, where there are certain details excluded or selected in and out, and it makes it sound a certain way that's unrealistic. But once you understand the context or understand more details, it makes perfect sense. And this has happened in biblical scholarship. We've come a long way from the 1800s, where they would point out to certain things, but then we would learn new additional details, and we would go, oh, that's what the text is talking about. It makes
so
perfect
far, I haven't
sense.
read any details that make sense to me. And even if you could make a case in the Old Testament that these events were spread out over long periods of time, and so people forget. I mean, read the book of John, and these events happened within the space of a year. Read any of the others, and they happened in the space of 3 years. This is less time than it takes to get a bachelor's degree at a typical university. You don't forget that quickly. These do not read like normal humans behaving like humans. These read like straw men. And I think that is what they are. But that said, look, I will talk about the New Testament and the Gospels and some other time. So preview people, there you go. But
it's the same in the old. It's the same thing going on in the Old Testament. You've got this false view of what happened in a simplistic way, and it's not your fault. It's what we learn in Sunday school, right? Because we just have
when we just read the story. That's how the story reads.
Right. So I think that's where it's important to understand how the Bible's written. It's you're assuming certain things going into it. Like it wasn't it's clear God lifted a mountain over your head. He explained to them, look, there's an afterlife. I'm God. It's kind of like the modern Jewish rabbinic notion that there's God gave Moses the oral law in its entirety. They had perfect understanding of everything, even to the point where Moses traveled to the future and witnessed a debate between Rabbi Akiba and Hillel or versus Shillel or something like that. This is not what happened. It wasn't instant. Oh, they had complete, proper monotheistic knowledge at the point that miracle happened. Then the next day, literally, they're building a calf statue. That's not realistically what happened. Even if it maybe from a simplistic reading of the text, it might seem like that because of the way it's written. We have to be.
Forgive my simpleton reading.
Not as an insult. I read it. I read it the same way.
This is actually one of the few times when I don't think you meant it as an insult. So I take it.
Yeah, but I read it the same way. But I'm just saying we have to be responsible in our reading and realize that there are things going on beyond our understanding, and we get this.
But I can't remember our presuppositions coming in. I read it as a piece of literature. You're theologizing on top of the literature and bringing in presuppositions. So I don't think that there are things we have to understand. I don't think there are these other hidden messages that the Spirit reveals, or that if you spend another 3 years in college, you'll get the secret meaning. I think it says what it says and mostly means what it means. I think it's fairly straightforward literature. If it's not, I'm not saying that it couldn't be. If it's not, if there is something more going on, then I think it defies what the average person can actually be expected to read and comprehend. And you can put that as reason number 357 in my series of why I stopped reading the Bible or caring about it, and why you shouldn't care about it either.
Okay, so I would just deny that. So I'm not. My case today really relies on reading this as historical literature. The only assumption that you've drawn to bear is that, look, I need to assume that, and we can get into arguing textual scholarship, textual criticism for the Old Testament text and that sort of thing. But I just assumed that what we had in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in our Old Testament Bibles today, which we know was preserved relatively perfectly from the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls until the Masoretic text, and that's the basis of what we have.
I'm not arguing how well the Dead Sea Scrolls were preserved, though. When I talk about the textual criticism, I'm not arguing at it from that level. I'm saying whoever wrote those symbols down on the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves were interpreting. That is an interpretation as to whether they are saying, oh, well, this is Lord capital L, Lord small l, Lord capital four-letter Lord. That is not somehow a dictation from God, if I understand the Christian claims correctly. And so, you're unless you want to claim that in this case inspiration meant exact dictation and that they couldn't have gotten anything wrong, you're still leaving a lot of room for human error in there, or human interpretation.
Right. So I'm assuming though that the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, Samaritan Pentateuch and that sort of thing, they go back to the original authors in terms of what the text said. I'm not debating whether, somewhere along the line a scribe invented Yahweh or something, and that wasn't originally in Genesis or Exodus or something like that. I'm just assuming for the sake of argument, because you have to admit that's a totally separate topic, right? Trying to get into textual criticism and that sort of thing. So
yes.
Once you give me that, then I cannot.
This is kind of a throwback to that earlier discussion that we had. Though I was just clarifying my position. I'm not questioning whether we got the Dead Sea Scrolls right. I'm questioning whether whoever penned the Dead Sea Scrolls heard from God so accurately and in such a way that we can count on the exact strokes of his pen, that he used this word properly and not another. I'm just saying it's interpretation all the way down. When someone wrote Lord, whatever their word for Lord is. They then had to interpret, well, what Lord does this mean? Is it that Lord? Is it that Lord? And they wrote it down. And I don't see any reason why we should look at that then and say, well, that's, that then is exactly what God had in mind. Randall Rouser is a sitting theological professor. When I say sitting, people, I just mean he's a practicing professor right now. He's not someone who's retired to do speeches and books. He disagrees with you. He would agree with me.
In what way? No, he wouldn't.
Yes, he would.
Depends what you mean. Okay,
Yeah. He would not suggest that just because there is a word there, that we have somehow an exact, precise dictation of what these words and tenses should be. We have humans, doing their best to understand the message of God, and they can get the translation and the transmission wrong, and they often did. He would agree with that.
I guarantee you, yes, and so do I. But I guarantee you that Randall Rouser would agree with me that in the case of the Lord all capitals and the Lord not all capitals, he would agree with me that the scholarship that's not a mistake. That's how the original texts were written. They made this distinction over and over and over again. It's not just.
But you're still missing what I'm saying. I don't care about that. What I'm saying is the people who made that distinction might be wrong. We have no way of knowing that they were right every time they made that decision. That's a human decision they made.
Who are we talking? Are we talking about the original writers, or are you talking about the copyists?
Well, look, go back to the original writers. We don't have the original writers. We don't know who the original writers were. We don't have the original writings. There are no autographs of the Bible. But I'm just assuming the autographs. Just assume the original writers in this conversation. We have no reason to believe that the original writers would have been correct. And this is what Randall would agree with me on. He thinks that the Bible is full of situations where they just got the message wrong, where they misrepresented God, where they said God said this and God never said this.
Okay. I guess
when
I don't
you build your case on something like the particular tense of this particular Hebrew word, I think you're building it on a house of straw, or building a straw house on a foundation of sand. I don't know.
Okay,
make your own metaphor.
Let's remember what I'm doing, right? This is a continuation from a Coherence of Christian Theism series last year, because I never got to get to the Trinity and Incarnation part. So I'm arguing for coherence. I'm not arguing that the Trinity is true in these series of blogs.
Right, but you're arguing that the Old Testament is consistent with it based on the simple words that you see in it. And I'm just saying, no, we can't do that yet. I think you're going to have to go deeper, and I think you're going to have to make more of a case. I'm not saying that your case is lost, that you haven't made your case, that you can't make your case, but you haven't made it today.
Oh, yes, I have. So let's. This textual issue is totally beside the point. If you're giving me the originals, if you're giving me the original authors saying this, great, then I've made my case. If you're not giving me the original author said this, but the authors of the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls, multiple authors, all made the same mistake around the same sort of time, then I would say I could argue on textual grounds that's improbable, because we have examples where these texts.
Also note what I'm saying. I'm happy to give you the originals, which we don't have, but I'm happy to give you that, because it doesn't matter.
Okay, so the point is, then I can't prove that they were inspired when they wrote this. They could have been teaching the Trinity. Pretend they taught the Trinity explicitly. God is a Trinity, but I'm not trying to prove that they were inspired when they wrote that. I'm just saying, look, we have this text and it teaches the Trinity and or it teaches God as a complex unity in a way that's consistent with the Trinity. That's my technical claim. Whether the text is true or false,
right. What you just said is what I plan to bring up next week. When you talk about the Trinity, once again, everyone has to realize I can only guess at what you're going to talk about because
it's going to be. I'll tell you up front. So it'll be the New Testament. It's again a scriptural question, and my pivotal text is the opening verse in John. I don't anticipate you're going to deny that John saw Jesus as divine or something like that, or that he taught God became incarnate. Jesus was God.
At the moment, I don't plan to question that.
Okay,
when I'm forced to look into it, who knows what I will dig up? But I don't. That's not something that it crossed my mind to question.
Cool. Okay, and most people don't. Like, in fact, no one does. Richard Carrier wouldn't. But so I'm using that as the pivotal text in my series, and then I'm going to compare it to. Depends how much space I have, because this blog's like 2,300, and I know you want to keep it to 800. So I might do comparing that. Is John's text there consistent with earliest Christianity, Paul's writings, and the Gospel of Mark? Because that's where skeptics will try to say, well, Paul didn't teach this, or the early Christians didn't teach it,
right.
And they'll say Mark.
There are 2 or 3 different types of Trinitarian view in Scripture. One of them would be John, where you start where Jesus is God from the beginning. Another would be an adoptionist view, where where God adopted Jesus. There may be a third view where Jesus kind of grows into godhood after, or becomes God after the resurrection. I mean, there are some different views there, so definitely something to be talked about.
So that's what my plan is. And if you want to see the universalizing thread, so how does this Old Testament blog relate? I've established what Yahweh exclusivism, based on what Richard Bauckham argues is the divine identity. Those two fundamental characteristics. It's not a what question, an ontological question that the Jews, even in the New Testament, they're not getting into the what question really. They're getting into who God is. So his extrinsic relations, his covenant, or relations with the people of Israel, implying a cultic monotheism, some people have called it, and also that there's God's extrinsic, unique relations to creation as a whole. He alone is the creator of everything, and he alone is the sole ruler. This is how the Jews of the Old Testament would have, if you asked a Jew, what made your God so special? This is how they would have answered, and it was the same.
Asked the right Jews at the right time in history, that's what they would have said. If you had asked the different set of Jews the different time in history, they wouldn't have said that. I mean, look, you said it yourself earlier, and I mean, we keep coming back to this because this is so complicated. This is not a one size fits all. The Old Testament Jews believed blank. They believed everything. It just depends on when.
So, and to clarify, so remember, I said I don't care about Jews as individuals. That's supplementary information.
But you're talking. It seems like you're talking about what the biblical Jewish writers were trying to portray. As the official word and nature of God, and even when you just stick with that, it seems that many of the official writings acknowledge councils and all out other gods and powers other than God.
They do. But did you get my argument? So I acknowledged that, and I said that's not a problem. It may be problematic for us as Christians because we're uncomfortable with that, but I'm saying that wasn't a problem for establishing the divine identity of Yahweh that I'm going to be arguing for with the New Testament. I'm going to be saying that Jesus shares in this divine identity according to Mark, and that's how we get to say
let's find out. But I can't tell you whether it's consistent that Jews could see Jesus as Yahweh at the moment without understanding what you are saying the Jews considered as personhood to begin with, and how much, just how much room did they have in their definition of persons? Could it have included, a persons as, say, I think of as persons? I don't know, and so I'm just going to have to wait until you make more case before I throw more iron at it.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I guess before we go to closing, because it's you that gets the last word since I started today. But yeah, my fundamental point is that look, the ancient Jews, even the New Testament, doesn't provide a proper understanding of what personhood is. What are the essential properties of being a quote unquote person? Why is it a dog is not a person, but human beings are a person? That's a philosophical question that the Bible itself, even as late as the New Testament era, doesn't spell out explicitly. The Jews and the earliest Christians that wrote the New Testament aren't thinking this way. That they don't care. That comes later on in the 2nd century with Logos Christology, where they start to try to put together the raw biblical data and make sense of it. And we'll be, in part 3 we'll be learning about Logos Christology, which is the first attempt, right? Obviously stemming from John's gospel about Jesus being the Logos and that sort of thing. But for the point here, it's with the Bible, we have this divine identity of Yahweh. There are clearly multiple persons that fall under the united name of Yahweh. And this isn't polytheism. This isn't saying that they're the same. That it's a closer, for the ancient Near Eastern mind, it's a more unified thing than just saying, oh, they're a bunch of individual people sitting on a council. There seems to be more of it in that they get to share this divine name, and other people of the heavenly host don't. The angels don't get to go by the name Yahweh. The other pagan gods don't get to fall under Yahweh. Jesus does, or this wisdom, or the Word does. For the Old Testament, the visible God does get to have this name Yahweh. So there's something here that hopefully I'll spell out in future things. But I think there's enough here to wet your whistle and go, yeah, that's my case. And yeah, go ahead, David.
Yeah. Okay. So we speak of the presidency, and we might be thinking of the current fool who sits in the chair behind the desk in the Oval Office. Or we might be thinking about the Secretary of State, or some other member of the President's cabinet. That's not ruled out either. I don't think that we think of it in some complex sense of, some single being with multiple personalities that, gets to incarnate in different forms in different places at different times. So I think we could speak of the presidency in much the same way that the Jews sometimes spoke of God. It's plural, it's singular, but it's not terribly complex. Those are just accidents of language, but we know what we mean. And when a Christian talks about a complex unity, we don't actually know what they mean. And so it is a different thing than what you might be tempted to agree with. And so we do need to dig in there and figure out a little bit more of what the Christian has on offer. Now, I would argue that most Christians don't have anything on offer beyond this. They haven't really thought about what is a Trinity exactly. They just hear that you're supposed to think it, 1 in 3 persons, done. Let's go have a pizza. I applaud Dell for thinking about it more deeply than that. But at the end of the day, it's still going to require some kind of explanation that's going to sound an awful lot like magic at the end of the day. but so far we haven't even really gotten to the magic yet. So I will push this issue forward as we go. I don't know exactly where it's going to go. I don't know what part 3 and part 4 is going to have, but I will try to do my due diligence in asking the questions that suss this out further. So I'm going to invite the skeptics in particular who are listening to this episode and who joined me in some of my confusion and hesitancy at the moment to ask the questions that you want me to ask to help clarify this thing a little bit more about complex unities. Again, I want to make it clear, I'm not saying that Dale is wrong. I don't know if I can say that right now. We just don't have enough. The Old Testament is not very clear on this. I don't think it was ever very clear on this. I tend to think that was a problem. If it was ever important, God should have made it clear to somebody at some point, and it just never seems to happen. And so then we get to the New Testament, and Dale admits that the Trinity is a little bit clearer there, but not completely. So again, we might end up with a brick wall where we've got half a bridge that seems to be leaning toward a certain direction, but it's not complete, and we don't actually know where it would end up if it was completed. And we're filling in the rest of it with headcanon. So yeah, let's see a little bit more of the case and see where we go from there. In the meantime, next week, I have been vacillating a lot about this. I was going to go miracles, but Dale had asked to put that off because that's going to be a bigger discussion. We're going to have to dive into some material that neither one of us has time for right now. So next week, I'm going to talk about something very near and dear to my heart, which is the reasonableness of disbelief. And I'm going to this is a visitation of an older theme, but I think it's time to bring it up again. And I'm going to ask Dale to maybe do something a little bit different than what we normally do, which is I will rather than trying to make a counter case for why disbelief is not reasonable, I want Dale to make a case for the reasonableness of belief, and we simply make
switching
positive. No, I want you to make a case for the reasonableness of belief. So I want you to make your case for why why belief in God is reasonable. I will make my case for why belief in God is not reasonable, and we will just both make positive cases and let the audience sift through it and see who makes the better case.
Okay. I feel like we...
Yeah,
okay.
It's time to revisit it. And in this, it's not to say that there can't be a small section where you, if you think that my case, especially in the written form, has a blatant hole in it, that you can't rebut that. But at the end of the day, I'm a little bit fed up with listening to Christians make the weakest cases about why, it's reasonable in some Pascalian kind of way to believe, but ignoring that if that's the only case you want to try to make, it's also equally reasonable for skeptics to disbelieve. And I don't think we make that case enough. So I am going to make that case next week. I invite Dale to make his best case for the reasonableness of his belief. But if Dale, if you want to spend your entire time just making the case for why disbelief is unreasonable, you can try. I don't think that would be the best use of your time.
Two sides of the same coin. Yeah, I'm just wondering, how is this going to be reasonableness for belief in God? We did a show on the existence of God. There are arguments. There's the property based, the sensus divinitatis, which provides. Are we repeating the same? What is it?
You might be repeating the same thing. I don't know, but I will not be. And there has been once again a resurgence, let's say, for atheists to make their case. And I will not be, to be clear, I will not be making a case for why there is no God. That is not actually the atheist position. I will be making a case for why it is reasonable not to believe in one.
Okay, even if there is a God. Okay.
Even if there is a God, with the current, with what we have right now, it is actually reasonable not to believe in a God. And what Christians have been saying a lot is that somehow, there's something wrong with us, or that there's some kind of bad motive. You don't have a good reason to reject God. Yes, we do. And the Christian wants to reject that the skeptic is being reasonable. Now, the Christian, oh yes, we're being reasonable to believe in this thing, but the skeptic, they're not being reasonable. I want to make the case clear that that is simply untrue. And whether or not I think the Christian is being reasonable or not is not really any part of the case I plan to make.
Okay. All right. I'll try to think. I'll talk to you after the show and maybe get some ideas as to how I can differentiate it. Because on my side, I don't want to. We already did a show on the existence of God. I don't want to go over that again. So I'll talk to you and get some ideas of maybe something different